morning. You're listening to me? Okay, nice. It's a pleasure to be here, and let's go. Playing with wonders, objects, role-playing games, and the cultural legacy of Bispo do Rosário for the city of Rio de Janeiro. How do objects impact thinking? How can objects influence our knowledge about the culture of a place? How could an object be used to rescue stories and memories linked to a city and thereby expand the existing cultural heritage of the place? How can storytelling and role-playing connect with these objects? And from this mixture emerge narratives and role-playing games that involve the history of Rio de Janeiro. To answer these questions, we explored a concept, the living objects. The living objects are elements created to cause people to have strange and awakened thoughts beyond those stabilized by reason alone. They stimulate the exploration of fantasy, desire, and daydreaming, and they enable new creative paths for imagination. We focus on objects that are part of the cultural heritage of the city of Rio de Janeiro, especially those created by a historical figure, Bispo do Rosário, who produces several artistic objects during the decades that has been a patient in a psychiatric hospital. One day, I just showed up Arthur Bispo do Rosário. Our thoughts were intensified by the contact with the artistic work of Arthur Bispo do Rosário. He was an artist who spent almost all his life as a patient in a psychiatric hospital and produced more than 800 artworks and became one of the biggest names in contemporary art in Brazil. At first, in the absence of material, Bispo would have revealed the cones of blue uniform, so he used then threads in his embroidery. Undoing his own uniform, this construction, one of the great symbols of psychiatric power, and he using the raw material to build his parallel universe, his utopia. His creative process consists of resignifying elements and creating objects which refer to people, places, and memories. Bispo mixed reality and fiction in his pieces, building worlds in the midst of the space that have been restricted. He began to pick up objects from the hospice, and he ordered them in different aesthetically colorful, playful, subjective. His work inspired us to structure a way of creating stories, fulfilled by the poetics of delirium. The word delirium suggests not the strict meaning fixed by psychopathology, but the broader meaning that receives when in the art-filled context. Deriving from lira or furrow, delirium means moving away from the groove, that is, from the straight path of reason, in this case of artistic rationality. We use this strategy as a basis for the experience we carry out, and for then we create a cloak inspired by one of the most famous pieces by Bispo do Rosário, the presentation cloak. One of the hypotheses on which we base this work is that objects created by Bispo do Rosário cause wonder and enchantment in people. This process facilitates thinking that goes beyond reason. We follow under the scent of Sarah Tindal Kareem. She said, both wonder at wonder about objects. These two types of wonder correspond to two distinct meanings of the English verb wonder, denoting surprise and marvel on the one hand and doubtful curiosity on the other. In this way, the piece created by Bispo caused enchantment among those who had contact with them, even more so when they left the place in which they were created and began to circulate between musicians and exhibition space. This kind of enchantment leads to what João Pereira points out that Charles Lefort defines as unthinkable. Claude Lefort defines the unthinkable of work as the work that itself performs with the receiver, reader, or spectator, and that, therefore, it depends on the receiver to make itself, to consecrate itself as a proper work. The unthinkable and the questions generated by the contact with the cloak make a conceptual bridge with the living objects. Precisely the objects created by Bispo do Rosário are aimed at representation and communication, and which cause the unthinkable, and question in those who establish contact with them, we understand them as a living objects. In addition to these questions made by the cloak itself, the elements used when creating the experience are totally foreign and function as a romantic fragment of a joke, witz, which causes estrangement and force who comes into contact with them to think out of the box. One of the living objects provoking witz is the clipping of the research, the presentation cloak. The presentation cloak was the piece that Bispo do Rosário made through embroidery, names, drawing of objects, fragments of stories, and various stories elements. This is the presentation cloak. Bispo work inspired us to develop the storytelling cloak, which works by connecting with various biographical, fictional, and historical accounts of the participants, weaving a web of narratives between people, their stories, their memories in and about of the city of the Rio. It represents the works of Bispo. It's an easy format to object for us to take to experience. It's an object that could be created, resignified, and thought of in a unique way by each participant. It was conceptualized together with the designer Paulo Aragão. It's double-sized and can be used on either side, allowing possibilities of use. It has a structure that allows people to create elements and reconfigure it. These elements are secured with small safety pins so they can be removed and the cloak would be blank state again. And this is... Oops. What it is? Okay. This is the cloak, and there's elements you can use. The cloak function as a source of renewal, the narrative fragments created from the material repertoire of stories collected in use. First, the cloak not only helps its creation and telling of narratives, but also collects and incorporates the stories wherever it goes. So that's cloak. The participants were asked whether or not they know the work of the Bispo do Rosário, introduce the cloak and the elements available. They could create new elements in addition to existing ones, inspired by Luciane Hidalgo's definition of Bispo do Rosário works. Each participant was asked to create an autobiographical, narrative, and fictional one, and a historical one related to Rio de Janeiro. There is also the brief and the feedback and suggestions. The idea of this experience was, in addition to testing the creative process with the cloak, rescuing Bispo's practice and presenting his art to the participants, also to collect stories, character, places, inventories, and memories linked to the city of Rio. The object was to make the cloak a living object and an instrument of the imagination so that could serve as exploratory tool of knowledge, while at the same time concentration connecting stories that are part of the intangible cultural heritage of Rio. And the experience presented to the participants were also designed to incorporate narrative and role-playing elements. The word is in the cloak, and the characters emerge from these objects and from the memories, peoples, and place created. The main sets created from interactions with the cloak, the material elements used, and the sharing of the stories. The narrative and role-playing process take place through knowledge of the roles, and contact with them, and contact with the words takes place through the cloak, which works as an intersection portal between the space imagined by Bispo and the other created by the participants. I need these words writing, Bispo do Rosário. In this part, we'll tell some of the stories created by the participants. A participant created an auto-fictional narrative and told a story that narrates the development of his childhood until the present day, incorporates the pen used to write on the fabric as one of the props of the cloak. Represented the time in which he began to enjoy drawing. He later created a micro role-playing game in which person used a fragment of their personal life to narrate a stage in the character's life, and each person continues the story from where the other left. In the first experience, he created a narrative in which Rio de Janeiro is reported from 3 points of view from different socioeconomic groups, reflecting the enormous social difference that marks the city. It also describes how the story could be turned in installation. And his installation, this experiment, we reflect on my view of Rio de Janeiro being always limited to my sociocultural context. I was inspired to talk about Rio de Janeiro from a set of different perspectives. From there, I had the idea of a public mobile installation, which people from which place would write about their perspectives of the place where they live, about their pains and their pleasures. And inside the installation are writings, expressions, and from other people having been elsewhere. Physically, it could always expand from a center. Each place a new installation takes place. In such a way, the new participants are always on the fringe. Conceptually, it would be a way of getting to know the city better from the perspective of the people themselves and not necessarily from the physical space. First, decentralizing our perspective and then get to know others who could possibly be outside our social bubble, despite position in the same space. There's some elements. In another experience, the cloak, a participant told the story about the personal aspects and choose the space of the cloak as a mapping of feelings, elements that represent affection or position next to the heart area, and the elements are scattered out the cloak. Another participant, a nurse who happened to be an intern at Colônia Juliano Moreira, the hospital where Bispo lived, created stories of striking elements of this period. On the first experience of autobiographical narrative, the most curious things was a title from the hospital which he got from a patient who had lived there for many decades and told him to always carry with him. He made the title by folding a piece of fabric and added its storytelling cloak and narrate the story. The symbolic title is now part of the materials that can be used on the cloak. In the second experience, he created an interactive fiction structure using various elements and fragments, which are red being. He set up configuration of the cloak, in which door is a labyrinth where characters involved, leads to a narrative fragment created by another participant. And whoever experiences this character has to create a new narrative, which works as a kind of fragment of humor joke and encourage the participant to create from something that's totally strange and unknown to him. There is also a game he created to a storytelling game using the elements of the cloak. Developments and reflection. There are still other objects created by Bispo do Rosário to be explored, such as the banners, and there are still many stories to be told. But the experience with the cloak pointed out new possibilities in the use of the objects as a form of creation, which explores the spatial use of the body and objects in a innovative way, as well as the boundaries between materials, elements, imagination, memory, and the intangible heritage of a city. They were rescued and materialized in objects, character, place, and stores of Rio de Janeiro. In this kind of collective imaginary cartography of the city, the space of a place expands beyond its physical border, where the truth narratives of role-playing games created by the participants, it incorporates feelings, memories, and creations, real, fictional, or historical, of those who wear the cloak. And through this process, a city's historical and cultural heritage grows, incorporating official, unofficial, and marginal elements. Or as Bispo do Rosário said, one day I just showed up. There is an update here, and I will try. This month, Colônia Juliana Moreira, after 80 years, ended its activities as a psychiatric hospital. And the director, Alexandre Ramalho, the hospital director, said, "Whoever went in did not came out. There are cases of inmates who spent 70 years, decades here and died at 90 inside Juliana Moreira. And a mark is the lack of history of these people." So next week, we will visit Colônia Juliana Moreira. And the idea now is to use the historical cloak, other objects, as well as narrative and role-playing, so that stories of those who were in the psychiatric hospital and those who are still there can be told and recorded, and listen to their life stories and what they have to say.